Thank you very much, Marie Toussaint and Christophe Clergeau. Thank you so much for hosting this event. We are here jointly with my colleague, Head of Science and Policy, Angeliki Lysimakou. My name is Martin Dermine. I'm the Executive Director of Pan Europe. Yes, indeed, for us, it is very important today to organize this debate, because during the last EU mandate, we have discussed a lot about global pesticide reduction, about the famous SUR, so the Commission proposal for a new regulation on the sustainable use of pesticides. And there were a lot of discussions, debates, negotiations, a little bit more percent, a little bit less percent decrease in pesticides. But we had the impression that over the last years, the focus on the true negative impact of pesticides, both on biodiversity and human health, was much less discussed than in the past. So in the end, we tended to think that, well, we can reduce a bit more, a bit less, but actually on the ground, it leads to real human dramas. Pesticides are toxic, and the first victims of pesticides, apart from biodiversity, are the farmers, bystanders, rural area people, farmers' families. And we clearly think it is important to bring back the focus on the toxicity of pesticides. So thank you very much again for helping organizing this debate. As Marie Toussaint said, pesticides are not per se mentioned in the mission letters that President von der Leyen sent to her candidate health commissioner. It is fortunately named quite a few times in the report from the outcome of the strategic dialogues for the future of agriculture. But clearly, it must remain a priority of the Commission, and we as NGOs and jointly with our partners, we will make sure that it remains on the top of the political agenda. Many people often still keep saying, yes, but we're not sure, do cancer really come from pesticides, yes or no? The evidence is clear. The more people are exposed to pesticides, chronic pesticide exposure leads to an increase in a series of diseases. And Marie Toussaint mentioned vulnerable groups. Well, yes, indeed, children exposed to pesticides are much more susceptible to develop a series of pathologies, including brain cancers, leukemia, birth malformations, and so on. And the users of pesticides are more likely to develop also a series of diseases, cancers, breast cancer, prostate, but also a series of neurodegenerative diseases like the Parkinson's disease that is now recognized as an occupational disease in 4 member states, which is already a good improvement. So per se, the evaluation of the toxicity of the pesticides, the risk management are not sufficiently strict. This is our view. They are often lagging behind the state of the science. So it needs improvement. And this is also a reason we organize this event today. So without further delay, I will give the floor to the speakers. We have a very good panel of speakers. I really thank them for coming. You will hear today experts. We have one representative of EU institutions, Manuela Tiramani from EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, that I thank for coming from Parma. We invited also, we knocked at many doors in DG Santé, but unfortunately nobody came, maybe due to the fact that we're in a transition period. But now I will invite Mr. Schepers and Suzanne Astic to come and join me here. We will start with the first session on health impacts, exposure impacts of pesticides, and we will also have 2 remote presentations. So I will be very strict on the time. You have 10 minutes maximum. We will have the presentations first, and then we will welcome a round of questions and answers. So Mr. Schepers is, thank you very much for coming, is Associate Professor of Molecular Epidemiology. He is a toxicologist and expert in risk assessment at Radboud Institute for Health Science, in the Netherlands, and has over 150 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He will today talk about a small part of the numerous results that the fantastic Sprint EU-funded project delivered. Mr. Schepers, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks also for inviting me to talk about our contribution to research in this field. I will address let's say, some results that we can share with you today, recently obtained results from the project that's now already running 4 years. Next year will be our final year. Then we are planning a meeting also in Brussels and hope to see you again. But then we take the initiative together, maybe with partners, to also be sure that we have a good audience for that, for those messages. And then we will report our outcomes to the Commission, and also, of course, to our stakeholders. And all these results will also be published. So I have a background in toxicology. I work together with colleagues from 29 institutes, and we work together with farmers, neighbors, and consumers. So the results that I am going to show are actually an application of the so-called exposome, to collect data from the real-life exposures. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And maybe you can just move forward to show all the objectives of our project. So the SPRINT is the acronym for Sustainable Protection Transition. And we are delivering a toolbox with, let's say, tools that will provide the governments, policymakers, maybe also NGOs, let's say, to look at what the picture looks like, depending on maybe choices that we can make together with farmers, with consumers. Our main focus in this project is to do risk assessment. Actually, that's also what EFSA is doing. So I think that we should use the same methods, and then we try to, from research, come up with some suggestions for refinement of those risk assessments. And that can also be used to better assess potential changes in health status. Next slide, please. And especially transition we do together with farmers. So let's say in every country, of a total of 10 countries where we have our research, we just have discussions with farmers about the transition. I will show you later that they are also participating. And here you see the slide showing the 10 countries where we do collect our data. And then you see that we, in each country, have certain regions where we have a focus and work with farmers who do cattle farming, pig farming, but also different types of crops. And then on the right side, you see the types of samples that we collect at the farm, in the environment, and from farm animals, including the farm cat, as a kind of, let's say, interesting predator. Let's say our model, let's say, to also look at wild animals. We suppose that the cats go around the farms to catch mice, etc. So let's say we also look at bats, for example, as a kind of indicator to see about the, let's say, exposure of wildlife. But today I'm only going to focus on the first part, that's the human part. Next slide, please. And then we are looking at specific farms. So I, of course, see that when I present our data by country, you are going to compare countries, obviously, but I think it may be good to remember that we have done different types of crops. For example, for wine, for olives, we went to the southern countries. For potatoes, we went to Netherlands, and for grain, we went to Denmark, etc., etc. So let's say we are covering all types of different farm crops and farming methods. Next slide, please. But let's say it's good to remember that we collected all our data in the so-called growing season. Let's move to the next slide, please. And then maybe important for this, the topic of today, that we are looking at two types of farmers. Farmers that call themselves integrated management farmers, and farmers that call themselves organic farmers. Okay, so we try to compare. And also, of course, very important, try to collect data on how they apply farming systems. Next slide, please. And then you see that we are also aware of people living in a rural environment where they maybe at some point sit in the garden, then the neighbor comes with, starts to spray maybe a plant protection product. And then the last but not least, those are our references, consumers maybe living in urban areas, maybe also being exposed, but maybe mainly because they buy products that may contain residues. And we're also very much interested in other non-dietary routes of exposure. So we have a focus on non-dietary in this project. We try to find out, let's say, to what extent people bring in pesticides in their homes, by other means than food, and also look at, for example, what we call tracking, let's say the dirt, the street dirt under our shoes, to what extent it contributes. Next slide, please. Well, this is the whole collection of study participants. So maybe it's good to bear into mind that we have a gender balance, and that we have even distribution of amongst the three groups that we try to compare. So comparison is, I think, very important for the slides that I will show you. Next slide, please. And then what we have done, I think we have extended, because I think the default of looking at exposure in humans is a collection of urine, but we have extended to also collect feces and blood. I will explain what this may add. I should mention that, let's say, all the work we have been doing with these participants in our study was done according to ethics standards and GDPR standards. Let's say, I'm now talking about these results, but of course we have presented those results already to the participants a year ago. So on the next slide, you will see the collection of pesticides that we have looked at, and that's a considerable number, more than 200. This is a very delicate choice, of course. Let's say, what can we analyze and which substances do we think we should prioritize? And this is kind of, let's say, a justification for that. I think we would like to look at substances that have authorization, but also, let's say, we know that some substances that have been banned are still occurring in the environment and also in our food. I will not go into detail, but just tell you that we looked at almost 200 pesticide active ingredients in blood, also in feces, a very high number, and then in urine, we were somehow restricted to those pesticides for which we know, for which metabolite we can analyze, and also we have to have the standards for analysis. And then we also, let's say, had a focus on glyphosate and AMPA. For that, we needed additional methods, but we have looked at that carefully. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to skip this slide because of the time. So I will now move to the results. And maybe the first slide, next slide, will show how we compared the blood results. Can we have the next slide, please? And then you will see that they are listed by country, but then you can see by the bars. The upper bar is integrated pest management. Then you have the organic farmers and the neighbors, and then the consumers. And you can see that I show here the median number of pesticides in each blood sample. Okay, within each group. Okay, so then you can see that in the Netherlands, Italy, we have the highest numbers, and then I think it's also, that's the topic of today. Let's say that the farmers are likely to have higher numbers. Next slide, please. Or next. Then you can also see that maybe it's reassuring that biological farmers had lower numbers. The median number of pesticide in the blood was lower. I think in the Netherlands, there were even some that we found no pesticide, let's say, of all those 188, none. So they were very happy, of course. So but that also means that we have to consider that they are maybe also changing their lifestyle. For example, when they go to the supermarket, they're also buying biological products that may contain less residues. Next slide, please. Then we're going to look at urine, and then you see a very high number, let's say up to 16, but also you see many more differences. So I think urine is still a very good and sensitive matrix. And then the last slide is also kind of new approach, because that shows the features. And maybe you already expect that, of course, some pesticides will not absorb in our gut, but we are still exposed. So I have to explain, because the gut is exposed, but mainly the microbiome. The gut microbiome is exposed, and that's a concern because we think that changes in the microbiome could also have implications on health. So now I move to some a summary. Next slide, please. So let's say, I think that we have, in our project, we have prioritized 3 substances: glyphosate, acetamiprid, tibuconazole. The first one is a herbicide, the second one is an insecticide, and the third one is a fungicide. Okay, so those are substances that you will hear more about next year. And then we also, let's say, find out that people, let's say, have multiple exposures and that you see differences. Next point. And then I think there's a tendency that we see a bit lower numbers in our biological samples than farmers that do, let's say, the integrated pest management, which may indicate that there is an effect, but we should say that it's maybe also because of their changed lifestyle. Next slide, or next point. So, and then I think that we really think that biomonitoring is stepping up in Europe. I think that we have had a very big project, HBM4EU. That's part of the exposome idea that we need maybe also in Europe to do more biomonitoring, to do, let's say, long-term monitoring, that we know that what chemicals people are exposed to. And then I have some, if there's still time, I will just wrap up now and then tell you what you can expect. I think that we will, by back calculation, go from those substances that we have analyzed back to compare with ADI. Maybe for EFSA, that's interesting to know. Let's say to what extent, let's say, the exposure is still below ADI. And then we also, let's say, do what's called a risk assessment, and we do apportionment, let's say, to find out where are these chemicals coming from what sources, what routes of uptake, very important also for farmers. And then we do also this health impact assessment, where we do predictions, let's say, of the health impact of those exposures. Next, please. And then I think that, I think the health relevance will come from integrating uptake, let's say, looking at all sources and all routes of uptake. Next, please. And then, let's say, our real life occurrence data, that's, I think, unique data for Europe, because it's one of the largest projects so far. Next, please. And then I think that we would like to find out about sources and exposure routes for a more refined risk assessment. Next, please. And then I would like to just indicate where, let's say, maybe in the future we could match what our colleagues in the US are doing. They have the agricultural health study. That's actually the largest study. I think it includes more than 55,000 farmers and farmer families, where we get our data related to cancer, for example, to different types of mental disease and to neurological disease. So let's say we also should think about replicating that type of studies in Europe. Then we need definitely the mother-child cohorts, and I'm sure there are pretty many already running, let's say, in Europe, but also with a focus on pesticide exposure, because there are indications that there is definitely a risk for during pregnancy, and there is a risk of, let's say, changes in cognitive function in early life. And we definitely need to follow up until also high school age. Last but not least, We also need to look at the bioassays that we are using to assess the safety of new pesticides, and we'll also reassess the safety of pesticides that have authorizations to be entirely sure that, and I just list here the soft spots, let's say, in the pre-market battery of toxicity testing. And then the last slide, just to announce, let's say, our meeting in June next year. So we'll be in contact with PON and with maybe some of you who are interested, maybe also to join, to be sure that we have the right people at the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schepers, for providing us this very small overview of all the results you found. And we're really looking forward to being present next year at your conference. And also a lot of results are already published. So thank you again. So our next speaker, this was more about exposure. Now we will talk a little bit more about the impact it is, and we will also test the European Parliament IT system. Remotely is joining Mariana Fernandez, who is professor at the University of Granada. Thank you very much for joining us remotely. She is an expert in epidemiology and clinical research, and we'll talk about the long-term health effects of pesticides on citizens. Mariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of the panel because it's the opportunity to show the work of many, many people in my country that for many, many years have been just providing data from human exposure using birth cohort that my previous speaker already said that is needed to demonstrate the association between exposure and disease. During this time, we have been able to just find very worry association between not only exposure in the early life, but also during the life cycle. Next slide, please. So our data is based in a population-based birth cohort that probably many of you have already know about this specific Spanish birth cohort that is called INMA, Environment and Childhood. Many, many years ago, more than 25 years ago, several research from the academia, from the hospital, clinician, epidemiology, many different backgrounds decided that we needed to know the role of the most important environmental pollutant in the air, in the water, in the diet, in a specific, very important window of our development, that is during pregnancy, but also in the early life, and try to see if this exposure was related with adverse effect during the childhood, but now our children are not children anymore, are adolescent, and some of them obviously are adult, and we can even know, find out some very nice effect in their life. Next slide, please. So I will focus most of the data in the area of I am living is in Granada, South Spain, but most of the data is based in the human exposure and effect of 7 different areas in Spain, the 4,000 per my mother and child pair that we have been collecting during this time. Obviously, as my previous speaker said, we have been collecting human sample, urine and blood mainly. We don't have faces. It's very important also, but we didn't consider at that time that the microbiota was important. And we have also placenta from the moment of the birth, and we have been incorporating not only biomarkers of the exposure, but also biomarkers of effect, try to understand the initial event as a result of the exposure. Next slide, please. So at the beginning, of the cohort, in one specific area of the cohort, in the area of Catalonia and the Ribera of Ebro in Flix, ERCOT funded a specific industry based on the production of the all organochlorine pesticides. Not only organochlorine pesticides, but also chlorinated solvent as hexachlorobenzen that obviously was related to that specific environment, and the population living in that area was higher exposure compared to the other areas in Spain. So what we could see in that time was that the children that were born there were affected differently to the other one in their neurodevelopment. Next slide, please. Specifically, as you can see, in the executive function, when we compare the children, the most exposure one with the less exposure one, they could develop in the same way that the less exposure one. Exposure in utero, exposure in the mother when the mother were pregnant on this specific child. But now we don't have this kind of problem. But somehow we have less problem related with the persistent one, but because still we can find the prohibited one in very, very low amount in some human biological sample. But the problem now are the non-persistent pesticides. Next slide, please. Those are the ones that now we are focusing, and some of them are prioritized in the European Union. For example, organophosphate, insecticide, for example, some fungicide, some herbicide, as you can see, are just some examples. We don't have so many as my previous speaker, but at least a good representation what the non-pesticides that are already using in our countries. Next slide, please. Again, as we already saw, people are not exposed to only one pesticide. People are exposed to many. In this specific slide, what you can see is metabolites, specific pesticide metabolites measured in urine of the Spanish children. You can see there the frequency of detection is there. Not only one, they have pesticide from fungicide, they had metabolites from insecticide, they had metabolites for herbicide. So we need to consider, as already many of you have said, to consider the exposure, not to focus in very specific pesticides. Next slide. Also, it depends on the individual. It depends of where you live. It depends of your job, occupation. It depends of your social class. It may be your lifestyle, the diet that you have, if organic or is not organic, the different exposure that we can find. You can just see that there are different patterns depending if you are living in Asturias, north of Spain, you are living in Granada, in south of Spain, or if you are living in Valencia, they both to, for example, orange fruit. Next slide. What we have found is that people higher exposed to these metabolites have a consequence in their life, specifically in the thyroid and reproductive hormones. Urine metabolite of non-persistent pesticides alter the serum hormone in the Spanish adolescent male, but also in the female. But not all of them are affected in the same level. Next slide. We have found that the susceptibility, the individual susceptibility, in addition to the amount of exposure to the individual, can affect to the human health. In fact, polymorphism in gene encoding enzyme involved in the xenobiotic metabolisms may contribute to the individual variants in susceptibility to this specific toxic compound. Next slide. What is very, very worrying, we have been able to associate high exposure to these non-persistent pesticides to an advance of the age of puberty in female. This is a very important public health of concern, because if you have an early time of puberty, an early time of telarchy, the probability to have, for example, breast cancer later in your life is higher. Right now, breast cancer is the first cancer that is diagnosed in our world. And this is a very, very problem in our society, because it's affecting not only a high number of women, but it's affecting in an early age. Just recently, a very interesting research paper has found that now we are diagnosing women very early, between 40 and 50 years old, never seen before. Next slide. We have been able to associate exposure to this non-persistent pesticide with behavior function. Most of them are neurotoxic, we already know. And we have been able to demonstrate this association integrating exposure biomarker together with effect biomarker like the VDNF. Next slide. In this case, we have been used a cross-sectional design. It's much better to have a delay between the exposure and the effects, using a birth cohort, using a prospective study design, but also the data that we can have from cross-sectional studies is interesting. In this case, and always, we have many information. It's not only the data from biomonitoring studies, it's not only the data of the specific health outcome, we also integrate the social characteristic of the population, the social characteristic of the family, and those covariates that can affect both exposure and effect. Next slide, please. And what we have found is that increased behavior problem is related with higher concentration of this specific metabolite from this specific non-persistent exposure to the pesticide that we already are using in Europe. So we need to do something about that. Next slide. So not only in Spain, all of Europe, we don't have data from Cartagena. It's an area that is already integrated in the SPRINT project. But obviously, if we can be able to put all the data that we have been able to produce together through the last 25, 30 years old in the human European population, occupational population, farmer, but also a general population, pregnant women, child population, adolescent and young population exposed to low concentration, because more of the time the concentration are really low, but the exposure is to many environmental compounds that our data say that are relevant for our human health. So it's necessary to control not only the production, but especially the distribution and the exposure through diet, through air, through water, because this is causing problem in our human being. Exposure and effect combine biomarker and just strain the data and telling us that even toxicology data together with human data are needed to do something, especially to those that can mimic endocrine hormone, because they had additional capacity to many adverse effects. So we should measure the defect to many compounds at the same time to integrate the sposome together, try to solve the problem, but we cannot wait for more data. In the meantime, we need to reduce somehow the exposure to the human population to the most adverse compound and to the most vulnerable population. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana Fernandez, for this very interesting presentation. I hope you can hear the applause in the mic. Good. So now we have with us Suzanne Astic. Suzanne is the Brussels EU bubble face of CRIN. She is a lawyer specialized in chemicals legislation. And it's true that, as MEP Marie Toussaint said, vulnerable people often don't have a voice. And it's really nice that CRIN opened this Brussels position quite recently. Was it 2 years ago or something? Yes, so now, Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for introduction and for the opportunity to speak at this event, and also bringing the children's rights angle to this very important issue of exposure to pesticides. So I'm Suzanne Astic, I'm Policy and Advocacy Advisor at CRIN. So at the Child Rights International Network, we are an international and EU-based NGO, and we're using advocacy, art, and education to bring the child rights perspectives on environmental files, including hazardous chemicals such as pesticides. As you will see, we're using a lot of artworks that are made by our art illustrator, Myriam Sugranis. Next slide, please. I will be very brief on this one because I think the two previous panelists brilliantly covered the human health impacts, but it's just very important to remind why children are more vulnerable to the exposure to pesticides. And I just want to insist on the fact that we have this window of vulnerability both during the prenatal and afterbirth stages, because children's organs and the nervous systems are still under development, and they're also suffering an exceeding intake of hazardous chemicals. For instance, they are breathing more often per minute. They're also consuming more food and water relative to their body weight, and they are also able to absorb toxics more readily and are less able to excrete them afterwards. It's very important also to bear in mind that children have specific behavioral habits. That means that, as we know, we like to play on the ground, in water courses. They're exploring the world via the touch and taste, and very often, on account of their age, they are less able to evaluate the risks, to adopt protective behaviors, to use protective equipment, or, for instance, reading the label and understanding the warnings. Very importantly, and now we have sufficient evidence, it's been decades actually, that we know that the dose doesn't make the poison, especially for endocrine disrupting chemicals, for instance. So we know that exposure, even at the prenatal stage, can be very damaging and linked to severe health problems of children, and even at very low doses. So I won't get into the details, but as we heard, there are increasing risk of cancers, birth defects, neurological diseases, impacts on the cognitive functions, loss of fertility, and for children also, very importantly, the impaired brain development. Next slide, please. And what is very important also for today's topic regarding to rural areas is that we are facing increasing exposure of children in these areas nearby agricultural, field, for instance, and they are suffering from an amplified vulnerability. We have testing and scientific studies that show repeatedly that there is an increase in exposure of pesticides in European rural areas. For instance, very recently in May 2024, we had the joint research on trifluoroacetic acid that found TFA, which is a substance part of a PFAS group. It found TFA in new countries, and very importantly, it found that PFAS pesticides appear to be the main cause of water contamination with TFA in rural areas. So children living in these areas are drinking polluted water on a daily basis. So that's extremely dangerous, and it's actually very concerning because we know that in these areas we have an increasing marginalization, which also amplifies the vulnerability. So we know that children in marginalized demographic, including rural areas, are actually suffering the greatest harms of all. Because they have suffering from reduced resilience to diseases that can be associated with deprivation regarding to the economy, poverty, and also sometimes isolation. Sometimes they live in very isolated areas, so it's very difficult to access healthcare and hospitals, for instance. And also it also comes with, as I mentioned before, the contamination of food and water, which particularly threatens the most vulnerable groups, including children in rural areas, and also affects low-income communities in general. Next slide, please. Very interestingly, and as we know, unfortunately, is not only in the EU, because the European Union also has a part to play in the contamination of children worldwide. Because we know that there are contamination with pesticides around the globe. And unfortunately, because the EU still allows the export of domestically banned hazardous chemicals, including pesticides, to non-EU countries, it means that the EU is still responsible for part of the contamination of children, especially in rural areas in the rest of the world. And that is a double standard that is obviously unacceptable, and that can lead to severe children rights violation and also amplifying the marginalization of children in these areas. We can think of contamination of children in Brazil, but there are also exports around the globe, in the US, for instance, in Japan, in African countries. So it's a worldwide responsibility of the EU here. Next slide, please. And what's very important is that the impacts of this exposure and global contamination of children as being recognized as leading to children's rights violations. I will be very brief because there are so many reports from United Nations officials. As you can see here on screen, we had reports from the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN that mentioned that the states must prevent childhood exposure to toxics to protect children's rights to life, survival, development, health, and bodily integrity. 2 years later, we had the General Assembly resolution on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment that mentioned that the unsound management of chemicals, so that includes pesticides, interferes with the enjoyment of its rights. And finally, more recently, we had the Committee on the Rights of the Child that urged the states to address the adverse effects of environmental degradation on the enjoyment of children's rights. And we know how pesticides impacts biodiversity, also contributes to climate change. So that's obviously very relevant that the Committee on the Rights of the Child raised the issue, and that's intrinsically connected with the exposure to pesticides. Next slide, please. A cornerstone framework for when we're talking about exposure to hazardous chemicals and children's rights is obviously the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child. It's binding on all EU member states, so all the member states and national authorities have to uphold these rights. And very importantly, almost all the rights that are being enshrined in this convention are unfortunately negatively impacted by the exposure to hazardous pesticides. We have, for instance, the right to life, but we have also, as we mentioned, regarding to the impact on children in rural areas, we have the right to non-discrimination. Unfortunately, we know that children living in these areas are disproportionately affected by the exposure. There is also the right to the education, recreation, and play, which should be the right to enjoy going to and playing in playgrounds, going to school without being exposed on a daily basis to very hazardous chemicals, including pesticides. Very importantly, there is the right to physical integrity, which means the non-consensual physical or mental intrusion against the body constitutes a human rights violation. Physical integrity means the capacity of every human being to be able to make a decision about his or her own body. And it's been recognized that the exposure to hazardous pesticides and toxic substances in general actually constitute an intrusion and violates the rights to physical integrity. Finally, in the convention, it's important to remind that there is an obligation for decision makers to prioritize the best interest of a child when designing environmental and public health norms. That's obviously extremely relevant for EU institutions and the EU countries, and it's very important for them to bear in mind when working on policy making on pesticides. Next slide, please. At the EU level, there is also a lot of texts and frameworks that are legally binding for both the member states and the EU institutions, including the Commission and the Parliament, for instance. So, for instance, we have the Charter for Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and the Article 24 focuses on children's rights, and it says that the children rights may be guaranteed, and also the best interest should always be taken into consideration and in priority by public authorities and also private institutions. Interestingly, there is also the Article 2, again, the right to life, and the Article 37 that prescribe environmental protection. Obviously, this is extremely relevant when we're talking about pesticides and how we know that the exposure to pesticides and the contamination of water, soil, the air is actually impacting the environment. Finally, the EU committed also to protect children's rights via the EU Strategy on the Right of a Child, which is a key compass for decision-making, and which aims to mainstream a children's rights perspective in all relevant policies and legislation in the European Union. And it also includes the promotion of inclusive and child-friendly societies, health and educational systems. And very importantly, regarding to pesticides as well, all children have a right to a good standard of living. So that should mean also not being exposed on a daily basis to hazardous chemicals. Next slide, please. So what are the takeaways when we, look at these connections between the exposure to hazardous chemicals and especially pesticides in rural areas and upholding children's rights? Now it's time to act. We know enough. We have enough evidence about the impacts on children. We have independent scientific studies that outline that children, especially those living in rural areas, and both in the EU and beyond, are affected by the exposure to hazardous pesticides, and they are suffering for severe violation of their human rights that are enshrined in legally binding texts, both at the international and EU level. They should not only be protected because they are the adults of tomorrow or because they are the future generation or just because they are more vulnerable, but also because they are right holders today. They are entitled to a full range of human rights that should be respected, including from the infringement via the exposure to hazardous pesticides. So if the EU doesn't urgently take actions against both the production, the use of hazardous pesticides, as well as the export of hazardous pesticides worldwide, it will continue to be responsible for the ongoing children's rights violation related to pesticide exposure, and also to creating a toxic legacy that is contaminating children both in Europe and in the rest of the world. Next slide, please. So that would be my conclusion, and the main advice for everyone listening to this, working in the institution, is that always, when taking decision on the environment and health, upholding children's rights should always be a key compass for decision making in the EU, and it's not an afterthought. It's legally binding text. You can find more resources online on our website, as well as more artworks in our art exhibition, and I'm available by email, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Just a short comment. MEP Christophe Clergeau mentioned that we won't have a SUR, but we still have the SUD. The SUD is very clear in its Article 12 that vulnerable groups, so children, pregnant women, older people, etc., should not be exposed to pesticides others than low-risk pesticides, so organic pesticides. So it's already enshrined in the law, but unfortunately, it's not applied by the member states. So now the next speaker is François Veyrette. François is a teacher by training, and he's also the founder and director of Génération Future. Génération Future is a French NGO, one of the most active national NGOs against pesticides. François has also been the president of Pan Europe for 10 years. François, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Can I have the first slide, please? For that, I want to thank the organizing MEPs for this invitation. Yes, we are more and more often having new studies showing effects on the population living by crops treated by pesticides, effects on developing diseases, cancers, etc., like this new GeoCap Agri study published recently in France showing an increase of lymphoblastic leukemia in kids, an increase growing with the density of vines in a 1 kilometer perimeter around the children's home. So there are many numerous studies like that. So it poses a question. why, if we have a risk assessment of the exposure to pesticides for bystanders and residents, are we supposed to see studies like that? It should be something wrong with the assessment. That's what we are going to go through now. Next slide, please. So risk assessment, a short reminder, when you do a risk assessment, you calculate the exposure for residents. We have a method in Europe with an EFSA guide, and you calculate maximum level of exposure under normal condition. So it's supposed to be a worst case scenario, protective scenario. And you also, on the second point, calculate or derive a health no effect values, which are called acceptable operator exposure levels. And you compare both the exposure and this AOEL. And if the exposure is inferior to the AOEL, then you have an acceptable risk. If it's the other way around, the risk is considered unacceptable. Next slide, please. Our toxicologist, she couldn't make it today, so I'm doing the work for her, but she has been doing the job and the report. She has studied this EFSA guide and went through it very thoroughly, and she pointed out a few flaws in the exposure assessment, first of all. And you have here the main flaws she spotted. Next slide, please. First of all, the risk assessment for local residents is not required for products applied by powdering or treated seeds. It's only for liquid spraying. So there is no buffer zones applied for this specific product, and it's quite surprising because there is a risk assessment for ecosystems required for these products, powdering and coated seeds. The question is, why is there no such requirements for local residents for this type of products, but only a risk assessment for ecosystem? It looks very surprising to us. Next slide, please. Second worry is we saw that some routes of exposure are not taken into account. You have here a table showing how the routes of exposure are taken into account. And we noticed that exposure through inhalation of dust is not taken into account in the model. Yet we have many studies showing that contaminated dust inside the homes, for example, is a big way of contamination because the contaminated dust, contaminated by pesticide, that is 4 times higher in houses located near fields than houses further away from fields. And this is based on official data from INSERM and Santé Publique France. Also, the exposure from eating your own vegetable and fruits from your garden or own orchard are not taken into account, which is also a major flaw for us and underestimating the real exposure of residents close to fields. Next slide, please. Third point, we noticed that the studies including the EFSA model are old, few in number, and also the worst case values are not the ones that are used in the model. You have to know, for example, that to estimate exposure near vineyards or orchards, there is a single study from 1987, which is, by the way, not accessible to the public, which is due to feed the model. So EFSA itself, by the way, recognizes that, of course, we need additional data. This is not sufficient data. And the worst case values in the field study, which are used, are not the best possible, the more protective data. It's only the 50th percentile which is used instead of the 95th percentile. And the difference in level of exposure is very important because, you know, there is a difference which is more than 3 times between both levels, between the 95th percentile and the 50th percentile. To be very protective and have a real worst case scenario, we should, that's our opinion, use the 95th percentile, where the level of exposure are 3.5 times higher than in the actual scenario taken into account. Next slide, please. The meteorological conditions used in the model underestimates also the real exposure of the residents. in the model used to estimate the exposure of residents by treatment on low crops, the wind speed is 10 km by hour, which is about 2.7 meters per second. But you have to know that in France, for example, you can spray pesticides to up to 19 km by hour wind, which is about 5 meters per second, which is, practically the double of the value which is used in the model. And that's why the authorities, the RIVM from Holland, from the Netherlands, considered, as we do, that of course using 2.7 meters per second as a wind speed is not the worst case at all. And this has to be underlined. There again, we don't use the worst case scenario to estimate the exposure of the residents living close to fields. Next slide, please. Another major point is the physical characteristics of people, which are used in the model. We think they are not really protective for the general population. To calculate the exposure values, different groups are considered. For kids, for example, it's a group which deals with 0 to 14 years of age, but it's I would say only the 1 to 3 years of age, which is really representative here. It is considered that the kids in this group have 10 kilograms of weight, so it's protective, for example, for an adolescent, but it's not for the younger kids, because when you are between birth and 1 year of age, of course, you don't weigh 10 kilograms. So your real exposure is underestimated to what it is in reality, of course, because the weight is overestimated. And you have to know that 50% of boys and 75% of girls aged 1 year weigh less than 10 kilograms. So taking 10 kilograms as a reference weight is really underestimating the real exposure, because you consider the weight is too big. Same thing in the adult group. It begins at 40, at the age of 14. And there it's considered that your weight is 60 kilograms. But at 14, almost 80% of girls and 76% of boys weigh less, and sometimes much less than 60 kilograms. So if you take as a reference weight 60 kilograms, once again, you underestimate the exposure by a lot. So this once again, for these specific groups, it could be the same for 15 or 16 years old. It's for these subgroups, the real exposure is underestimated. Moreover, the inhalation rates considered in the model for local residents are values, average values based on normal activity, low intensity activity. But when you have kids, at home playing in your garden, of course, they just don't sit there calmly without any movement. So when you have more physical activity, you breathe more, and then you are more exposed to the pollutants, and here pesticides that are there in the air. Next slide, please. So this is a sketch to show what are the kids considered in the model, just for a quick smile. But it's true that I don't know any children at home that stay still without playing in the garden or outside very calmly. So this is a flow in the model. Next slide, please. There are also loopholes in the hazard assessment, so I'll go very quickly on that. But for example, when you consider genotoxicity, and you have some non-threshold effects, and when you have non-threshold effects, you can't define a safe dose like the AOEL. There is no safe dose. This is a flow in the model. Of course, we now know that co-formulants in the formulation of pesticides are not taken properly into account. This is developed by other networks. So this also adds uncertainty to the assessment. The cocktail effects between different products and pollutants is also not taken into account. We know that the Commission expressed its will to introduce at some point a mixture assessment factor, but when will it be done? And next slide, please. We also know that not all the available studies are used for the assessment. For example, here we studied the case of glyphosate during its evaluation, the recent evaluation. And since the last regulation on pesticide in 2009, there is an obligation to take into account all the scientific data, including academic data. But and you see here on more than 7,000 academic studies, only 30 of them were considered both relevant and reliable for evaluation. So this is very, very few. And it's a very small number compared to what industry provides. And so these studies, they have no points in the final decisions for the final decision, and even to decide on health values like AOEL, because it's considered that the weight of evidence is more on the industry studies side because of their number. So why that? It's because these academic studies, most of them are not conducted through OECD standards, which is not at all compulsory for academic studies, but it's a rule that was followed in Europe, and the effect of that is that many academic studies are not properly considered in the risk evaluation, and when you have to derive health values like AOEL. Next slide, please. So my conclusion would be that we saw that the assessment methods used to evaluate the exposure of bystanders to and residents to pesticides are greatly underestimating the real exposure. We've seen that in details because of the wind, the physical characteristics of the kids and so on. And also there are some flaws in risk assessment. EFSA itself admits that the model is not perfect and does not take into account all possible scenarios. It was expressed during the 2014 public consultation, but in fact, EFSA leaves it to national health authorities, risk managers, to take appropriate risk management measures. But in reality, that's what happens in my country, France, with HANSES, the national agency. The French agency, they rely very much on the data provided by EFSA through the evaluation. And when they define no spray zones, they say that they just apply science and reason makes it possible to, and what they publish are just necessary non-treatment distances, because they, in fact, don't take a critical view on what is provided by the EFSA model. So we have a paradox here with a model which is not perfect. EFSA recognizes it, but in practice, national authorities use the model without, modifying it at all. So we have a problem here, clearly, for our organizations. The exposure of residents is clearly underestimated, and we need an urgent reform of risk assessment for residents. Next slide, please. It's going to be the last one. And we try to summarize our conclusion in a drawing where you have this paradox that I try to explain at the end of my conclusion. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, François, for the very clear explanation. So now we will take a series of questions. I apologize, but we will skip the coffee break. So if you need a coffee or water, feel free to move around in the room. But we are a bit behind schedule, and I would like to make sure that all speakers have enough time to express what they prepared. So yes, I see a first question. Can you please always introduce yourself, name and affiliation, and always speak in the mic for the people attending remotely? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Martin, and thank you to organize this very important, interesting meeting. I'm Luigi Tozzi, Safe Food Advocacy Europe. I think that we have also to consider another part of the risk assessment, which should be is never taken in account, and are the micro and nanoplastics as drivers. They are present in the soils. We have seen, we have a lot of scientific studies about it, And we have presented also to the emerging risk in the last 3 years these results. We have talked with EFSA about it, and they never answer very well, at least. But the micro and nanoplastics are drivers that normally are used with pesticides, to drive the pesticides, or to drive the cosmetics and everything, the antibiotics also for our life. And those properties remains. And when they are in the soil, they can take other pollutants, also other pesticides, and drive into the food chain. This is something that increase, of course, amplify the risk, and that is never taken in consideration. I would like them to talk with the 3 scientists more about it and have a measure of the studies because it should be useful for the next emerging risk group in EFSA to take also your studies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will take maybe 1 or 2 more questions if there are. No? Yes, sorry.
Hello. Yeah, just a question on the first presentation. You mentioned that there were many banned substances that were detected. Was there a distinction in the design of the experiment or in the evaluation of the results between products which had been banned in the EU for a long time and were still persistent in the environment even after the ban had been implemented here, and those and those detected in the diets of consumers, which could be coming from abroad, using, for example, banned substances which are banned here but not banned in imported products.
Thank you, Andrzej. Any further question from the audience? I have one on my left.
Yes, I also have a question for the first speaker. Thank you very much for the presentation. I saw that you compared the IPM, but recently, some years ago, the surveys that were done at member state level, they were showing that IPM is not exactly implemented, and there are not specific measures to ensure the implementation. Also, that was one of the objectives of strengthening the Sustainable Use Directive into regulation. Did you look at, did you ensure that in these cases IPM was implemented? And then if you did, does that mean that there would be other cases where the exposure would be worse?
Okay, thank you. So as there are 2 questions for Paul, maybe we start with him.
Yes, I much appreciate the question about pesticides that we don't want to be there, that we find. So first, let's say you refer to, of course, the problem of persistent substances that, let's say, DDT and DDT products that we still find. Actually, they are the kind of positive control that we have. If we don't find them, our analytics are not in good shape, let's say. So actually, they are all around us. And you're right, of course, they have also still an impact on health and on environment. So that's why we decided that we will, of course, address those and also describe what we find. Then I think we also realize, I think, in this area of research of pesticides, we are very much aware that, let's say, we have done a study in 1 year, 2021. And during that year, already we saw that there were restrictions. So let's say authorizations that were not continued. And that's very interesting, of course. So for one substance, let's say, I think during the year, I don't remember exactly which month, but there was a kind of a ban put on a date. And then we were interested to see that actually we found a pesticide. And then we will have to look into the matter, let's say, to what extent is this a pesticide that was still being used by farmers. And we know that, for example, in Netherlands, we found out actually that farmers went to court to, and the court ruled that they could have an extension of the use. So that can happen. Other interesting, let's say, aspect is that even, let's say, if the farmer would stop using those pesticides, it would still be around, let's say, in the environment, and there would be indirect source of exposure. So certainly that's very interesting, but it's complex, I should say, but it's interesting, and we looked at that, and we are also going to, even let's say if we are not sure, we are just going to put out the questions for research purpose that of course is difficult to interpret. Then last but not least, a very important point that you suggested, that a pesticide that we don't want to use anymore, let's say that have no authorizations in Europe, we are can be still exposed to, because we import products from outside Europe. And of course, and you can see all the reports from EFSA, also from member states, that we find residues of pesticides that we have agreed not to use anymore, but they're still there, they can be found, and it's very important that we inform the public about what they can expect. And then, of course, when we are discussing blood, urine, and feces results, then, of course, we get these questions. Why do you find the current use pesticides that actually have been discontinued for use? And what do you think about that they are still on the market? Well, of course, that's a problem that we have to realize, that it's very difficult, let's say, to keep them out. Let's say we have to make consumers more aware of what they can expect. And also, let's say, they should be looking at those reports published, and they should sometimes maybe make decisions for themselves, for their kids, that, let's say, maybe they want to buy local food. I'm just giving an example, okay? They want to buy local food because then they know what they are buying, okay? So those are maybe kind of take-homes for consumers, but I think the consumers could be much better informed in that part.
Thank you.
I hope I covered all your...
And about the definition of IPM farmers?
Yes, that was heavily debated. Actually, it's a label that we put on the farm system. We were also criticized because we started, to talk about conventional farming, but that's not very nice, because we know that, of course, farmers are on the way, let's say, to improve their practices to more integrated management. And but what we did, and I think that's also part of our project, we also collected a lot of data on farming systems. I think that about half of the researchers are actually people studying agrification or farming overall. And I've not been able to talk about that aspect, but we will certainly get back to you about, let's say, what type of integrated pest management was applied in different crops in different parts of Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Regarding the question from Luigi Tozzi from SAFE, François, so it's about micro and nano encapsulation of pesticides with nanoplastics or microplastics in the environment that leads to increasing the exposure and eventually the absorption of pesticides. Is Génération Future working on it?
So I'm afraid this is not my field of expertise, but we know that there are vectors of pollutants, but no specific work from Génération Future on this.
Okay, thank you. Yes, unfortunately, I feared at Pan-Europe, we are aware that there are many plastic polymers among the coformulants that lead to micro or nano encapsulation of pesticides to increase their efficiency, meaning also their toxicity on targeted organism and possibly also on human health. But unfortunately, the state of the science is still not very developed regarding pesticides risk assessment specifically. So yeah, we cannot say more.
No, I will say you in the coffee break.
Okay,
There are
thank
a
you.
lot of studies about it.
Good. Okay, are there any further questions? Maybe one or two more? Okay, yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I was listening, and obviously here, Jovan Masler, a graduate from Wageningen University. So knows. It's a more of a general question directed at anyone who would like to answer, really. We heard a lot about policy and about changing the laws and applying things, but as we know, changing the laws can have a negative impact on people who survive on these pesticides. So, for example, the EU exports for a very cheap price, I'm assuming, to Brazilian farmers. But if we ban this export, then these farmers will inevitably, what are they going to do? We saw with the nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands that a lot of farmers were protesting, even though in the end it was a good step for the environment. So this theory is all good, but how do we empower the farmers to accept these changes that we want to make? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Maybe Angeliki. So it's about exports of EU-banned pesticides, specifically. So, well, the European Commission has strict rules when they develop new policies to develop impact assessments. Sometimes it's very long and complicated, and the member states ask them to redo and complete it if they consider it's insufficient. So normally it's taken into account, but then of course any change in policy has always an impact, positive or also negative. Some people, this is politics.
And that's the reason we have laws to protect some people from certain practices. On this, I was wondering whether you wanted to take this question since you're in the panel. Yes?
Yeah, I can, and maybe you can complement if you want to add anything on that. Actually, on the cost of, what it would imply in terms of impacts on, for instance, the importing countries. There are a lot of studies and cost, studies regarding to the impacts. And for instance, Corporate Europe Observatory released the studies recently about what it means exactly in terms of impacts on the population and also the cost. And there are a lot of benefits from banning the export, also because very often the negative externalities of being exposed to hazardous chemicals, including pesticides, and those that are banned are way underrated and underestimated. So actually it costs so much in terms of healthcare and also for the families, especially in very poor areas and low-income communities. Pretty often it costs so much just to have access to healthcare, to the medicines, or even access to justice when you want to stop the contamination and to have access to legal remedies. So there is the balance here to address, and of course we need a whole system that supports farmers, for instance, from moving towards safer alternatives. And that's also where policies have to play a role. And of course, we're not, talking like, oh, you phase out, but you don't support the communities, you don't support farmers, you don't support the parents, also like taking care of children. It's a whole system that we need to reflect upon and really, work all together. So because we cannot continue to be against the nature, but we need to work with nature. And that also goes with safer alternatives and solutions that are fair for the farmers. And that's also protecting their health and the health of their children. And the double standards here is particularly problematic. But there are a lot of analyses, and that's also why there are sometimes a lot of impact assessments. But unfortunately, sometimes poorly also address the benefits and the positive impacts of banning actually the export of chemicals. So yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. Yes, well, and also for pesticides, I think we also have a lot of experience now on non-chemical alternatives that are available and that are much healthier for farmers and the environment. So thank you very much for the people, experts we had now in this panel. We will move on to water contamination, in particular with PFAS pesticides. And we have Sarah. Where is she? Sarah, please come with us. So Sarah Johansson is a senior policy officer at EEB. She is our specialist on water, on the revision of the Water Framework Directive. And I leave you still a few seconds to get set up. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay, the floor is yours, Sarah.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak about this topic. So, just a few words about our organization. I work for the European Environmental Bureau. We're a network of 180 environmental civil society organizations, including Pan-Europe. And we have member organizations across more than 40 countries now, and we work on a really broad set of topics. But yeah, I will focus on the water today. And I was asked to talk you through a bit the EU legal framework on water protection with a special focus on pesticides and PFAS. So we can go to the next slide, please. So we have a good piece of water law in Europe, and we've had it for almost a quarter of a century now, the Water Framework Directive. It's our key tool to protect Europe's water, both from the quantitative, the ecological, and the qualitative aspects. But unfortunately, member states are still lagging behind in terms of delivering on their legal obligations to bring Europe's waters to good status. More than half of our water bodies are still not achieving the objectives of the WFD and are placed on different kinds of exemptions, such as timeline extension. I put here the data from EEA, the European Environmental Agency, from 2018. We are waiting for the updated State of Europe's Water report that we hope will come before the end of the year. But it's the 2018 data. And you can see less than 40% of the surface water bodies are in good chemical status. And although it looks better overall for groundwater bodies in some countries, including our neighbor Luxembourg, also the majority of groundwater bodies are in poor status due to pesticide contamination or agricultural pollution. And it is a topic that people care deeply about. The latest Eurobarometer survey that I think was from May this year showed that 78% of Europeans wants the EU to do more to tackle water pollution. So we can go to the next slide. So what is chemical status? It's for a water body, a surface like a river, a lake, to be in good chemical status under the WFD, it's assessed against a quite small subset of substances and their associated legal thresholds. So for surface water, these are listed in the annexes of the WFD and the Environmental Quality Standards Directive. We currently have 45 priority substances. So it's quite limited in comparison to the large number of substances actually detected in the environment, but we have 45 priority substances, and 20 of them are pesticides, including one group of pesticides, and we have one PFAS. For groundwater, we have EU-wide thresholds for nitrates and pesticides. And these are set in the Groundwater Directive, one of the daughter directives of the WFD. So when we speak about, it's a bit top of the iceberg situation. So even if the numbers of chemical status in Europe are quite depressing, actually, it's, as I said, it's a bit the tip of the iceberg that we see. So we can go to the next slide. So for these substances, the member states are obliged to monitor their presence in water and to make sure that the legal thresholds are not surpassed. So as I was hinting, some improvements are needed because the current list of priority substances for surface and groundwater, they are incomplete, they're limited, they're out of date, and they largely overlook the effects of chemical mixtures. So some examples, I mentioned there are 20 pesticides for listed for surface water, but 17 of them are already banned. So we're still largely focusing on old substances. This is still necessary in many cases because some of them are hard to degrade, they are still there, but we're lacking those that are in use now. Also, the threshold for pesticides in groundwater, it's based on the analytical methods available back in the 80s and the 90s. And it's not been revised since the adoption of the groundwater directive in 2006. And also because we don't have strict rules on which pesticides that should be monitored in groundwater, it's led to inconsistent monitoring. So in some countries, more substances are monitored, some are less, which maybe also is the reason that we have quite large differences in terms of chemical groundwater status between countries, because obviously the more you monitor, the higher the risk or the chance that you detect something. And as I said, the quality standards, the list of substances is largely focused on individual substances. So we miss the effects of chemical cocktails that are really felt by the aquatic life. So an update is needed. We can go to the next slide. So that's the reality, but I wanted to also say something about the consequences. Earlier speakers, they talked a lot about the health impacts of pesticides, but I think when we speak about rural areas, obviously health is there, but it's also the quality of life. Pesticides is their main driver of loss of aquatic life. I just put one recent study there from Switzerland, finding that in over 70% of the streams they examined, there was a lack of insect larvae and other small animals due to pesticide contamination. So it's a lack of life, essentially. We also have the topic of drinking water quality. Another just very random example, but in Wallonia, 16% of the water abstraction, the water abstracted for human consumption is not fit to drink because of pesticide pollution. And then you're left with options to dilute down to the legal thresholds, to treat the water, which comes at a cost, or to abandon the abstraction point. So speaking about water resilience, this is obviously not a sustainable way forward. I also put some numbers on the cost there, because if we need to treat these pesticides, especially if we're then getting PFAS into the equation, it is very costly, and it's often the households that need to bear this cost. So I think I just wanted to put this slide there to also speak about the consequences beyond the direct implications on human health and on life in rural areas. We covered some of that in a nice event we did here one year ago. Next slide, please. So just a few words also on the rules for drinking water. This is regulated in the Drinking Water Directive, and in the update in 2020, we got thresholds for PFAS there for the first time. We have a total PFAS threshold and a sum of PFAS limit. The member states can choose which one to apply, and they will enter into force in 2026. And on the topic of TFA, it should be included in the PFAS total, as it's as that should cover the totality of PFAS. We can go to the next slide. So, okay, yes, I'm closing. So just to say that even if we have these PFAS thresholds in the Drinking Water Directive, they are not based, those thresholds are not based on the latest guidelines from EFSA, but some member states have put stricter thresholds in place when they have transposed the directive into national law. Yeah, next, please. So luckily, we are in the moment of updating the legal thresholds for surface and groundwater in the EU. The Commission has presented this proposal almost 2 years ago. The Parliament adopted a very ambitious position 1 year ago, and in this summer, the member states in the Council also adopted their mandates. So now we're waiting for the trilogues to start. And if I have 1 more minute, I can say something about this too in the next slide. So in terms of pesticides and PFAS, the Commission proposal includes new pesticides, including glyphosate. Still, most of the new pesticides are already banned, so they are old. But as I said, glyphosate would be there. A group of 24 PFAS with a strict threshold, a total pesticide parameter in surface water, and also more metabolites in groundwater. So the Parliament endorsed this, but wanted even more, including asking for a PFAS total parameter that could capture TFA, while the Council rather went the other direction and wanted also to push the compliance date for new substances into the next decades, as well as to introduce new exemptions to the WFD. So I think I have my last slide. Basically, it's a call to the MEPs in this house we're waiting for the trilogues to start. We hope they can start soon so we get these standards adopted, including, and we have a very strong Parliament opinion, as I said. So it's for the new rapporteur and shadows to defend it in the trilogues. So I will close there, and then we can take any questions after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So now we will have Helmut Burcher from Global 2000. Helmut is a biochemist. So Global 2000 is Friends of the Earth Austria, sorry. Helmut is a biochemist. He's specialized in chemicals, pollution, and in particular in pesticides, and has been one of the front runners among NGOs to push the PFAS pesticide topic over the last years. So Helmut, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for inviting me here. As Martin said, I'm a chemist with a background on biochemistry and immunology. And in the next 10 minutes, I will talk mostly about a chemical with extremely high affinity to water, a chemical which, in my opinion, is currently the most underestimated chemical in terms of its environmental and health risks. This chemical belongs to the group of PFAS. It is the breakdown product of around 15% of the currently authorized synthetic pesticide active substances in the European Union, and its name is trifluoroacetic acid. The reason why we should pay more attention to this chemical is that we consume it every day through the water that we drink. TFA can be found in all bodies of water and in concentrations that overshadow the pollution by every other known human-made chemical. I will show you the data on that in a few moments. But first, let's have a basic look on some facts about TFA. This is, for example, how the molecule looks like. Next slide, please. TFA is an next slide, please. TFA is an acetic acid in which the 3 hydrogen atoms have been replaced by 3 fluorine atoms. That makes it a PFAS. And TFA has no direct use by itself. However, it serves the chemical industry as a starting product for the synthesis of numerous other PFAS, including the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals and, in much future amounts, the production of PFAS pesticides. But TFA is also a breakdown product of these and many other PFAS. And this is how it enters the environment. And that's where the problems start, because TFA itself is unbreakable, it's unstoppable, and it's toxic. What does it mean in concrete terms? Unbreakable, TFA is a forever chemical in the truest sense of the word. No environmental conditions are known, not even the harsh conditions of ozone treatment that is used for drinking water purification can break down TFA. It's unstoppable. The natural filter function of soil that retains normally chemicals and protects groundwater is not able to retain TFA, so it finds its way to the groundwater, and the same happens with filter systems for drinking water purification. And also with conventional chromatographic detection methods for pesticides or PFAS, so that PFA was not detected for a very long time in conventional analysis, and this, besides, may have helped TFA keep under the radar for such a long time because it's accumulating in the global water bodies since we estimate since the beginning of the 1990s. So, and the third thing, toxic. For decades, the industry portrayed TFA as a relatively harmless, toxicologically spoken, chemical without backing this up with studies. However, in 2021, Bayer, as a manufacturer of TFA, but also of numerous PFAS pesticides that break down to TFA, was forced to inform the European Commission under Article 56 of the EU pesticide regulation that TFA has caused severe malformation in fetuses in an animal study. And that's an alarming signal. And that's why the following graph should concern us. What you see here are the TFA levels from 36 randomly selected drinking water samples from 11 European countries, which we had analyzed together with members of Pan-Europe this spring and summer. And TFA was detected in 94% of the European tap water samples, and the average contamination level is 740 nanogram per liter. Next slide, please. So you can see this average. And what does it mean? Is it a lot or is it little? And the answer will depend on whom you ask. But one thing is certain, the average contamination level of 740 nanogram is many times higher than the concentrations that you sometimes can find in drinking water of pesticides, of metabolites, or other PFAS substances. So it's far above anything that you can compare with other human man-made chemicals. So that leads, of course, to the question, is there a health risk? And this is a question that is not easy to answer because the toxicological data is extremely limited. In this report, which I have linked to this presentation, and I'm happy to make it available to you, we did delve deeply into this issue. Here will not be the time to delve into that deep. Yeah. So I will make just a short summary. We came to the conclusion that based on the current science, we think that there is still, as the water, the levels that we found are still within safe limits. But the margin of toxicological safety is already very thin. So what can we say for sure is that these levels are not acceptable. And that is in a legal sense, because in drinking water and also in groundwater, there is a threshold value of, and I think Sarah has already said this, of 0.1 microgram. So this is this 100 nanogram per liter for pesticides and their relevant metabolites. So it must not be in drinking water above 100 nanogram per liter, but it is. And This presents challenges for all of us, and particularly for European water suppliers. How should this be dealt with legally? I would like to briefly highlight that both I and my colleagues at Pan-Europe believe that we should do everything possible to avoid the end of pipe solution. So because the only theoretically possible way to get rid of TFA from water is a technique that is extremely costly in an economic sense, but also costly for the environment. So it's harmful for the environment, and it leads to a water that is artificial and that is depleted of minerals and has to be artificially remineralized. So the problem must be tackled at the root, and the root is that PFAS, pesticides, or all PFAS, not only the pesticides, everything that emits TFA into the water has to be stopped emitting in the water, so it has to be put from the market. So the primary source is PFAS pesticides, which has been shown by a study by a German authority, the Environmental Agency of Germany, is the major source with 75% of the intake of TFA into the groundwater approximately. So what is the consequences? Yeah, we had argued Pan-Europe before the summer break already that PFAS pesticides, in light of these data, no longer meet the approval criteria and therefore must be removed from the market by law. In this context, my organization Global 2000 commissioned the renowned European law expert Peter Hilpold to produce a legal opinion on the question: are member states, in light of the new scientific findings on toxicity and on the widespread occurrence of TFA, entitled or even obliged to remove plant protection products that release TFA into the environment? So do they have to withdraw the authorization? And the answer to the very detailed legal opinion, which you can download here, is very clear. The opinion identifies 3 independent situations under which member states are obliged to revoke the existing approvals. Number 1, if the use of a plant protection product significantly and sustainably contributes to an upward trend in pollutant concentration in groundwater, then we face a non-compliance with the Water Framework Directive, and then the plant protection product has to be put from the market. Because this is means that the requirement for authorization is not fulfilled anymore. Number 2, different from and independent from number 1, if new scientific findings show that a plant protection product, as it is the case with such that emit TFA, leads to residues, so residues in food or in drinking water, that have been classified or have to be classified as probable reproductive toxins in humans, then, and this is currently proposed for TFA under REACH, then the respective plant protection product no longer fulfills the hazard-based authorization criteria, so health-based authorization criteria under the annex of the EU pesticide regulation. Number 3, and this is the most easy one, alone to have reason to assume that a metabolite or a breakdown product has reprotoxic properties is sufficient for the metabolite to be regarded as a relevant metabolite, and in this case it has to comply with the legal limit of 0.1 microgram per liter in groundwater or in drinking water. Since this is not the case with TFA in 94% of measurements, and that's also data from the authority that show similar results, it has to be put from the market. So not TFA, but TFA, of course, we should also get rid of the substance itself, but of course all the substances, the PFAS pesticides that release TFA to the environment. So to conclude, it's clear that member states are obliged to withdraw authorizations of plant products that lead to the emission of TFA into the environment. Moreover, we also believe that the European Commission is legally obliged to promptly revoke the approval of all active substances that break down to TFA. A confirmation of this through a legal opinion has not been performed, but it would be, of course, desirable. And finally, what is clear is that given the scale of the contamination, we can no longer afford to wait, no reason to delay. The facts are on the table and we have to act now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helmut. We're a bit behind schedule, but we can maybe take one or two questions. It's quite technical topic, but maybe there are still questions in the audience. No. Okay, so yes.
Yes, hi, I'm Sébastien Mouret from Euro, the Association of Water and Wastewater Operators. This is a question really both for Sarah and for Helmut. When it comes to TFA, we have this potential, depending on the interpretation by member states, limit of 0.1 microgram per liter, depending on whether it's considered as a non-relevant metabolite or not. As you've pointed out, even if we banned any pesticides that emit TFA tomorrow, there is already a considerable accumulation of TFA present in the water, including resources for producing groundwater. So wouldn't that then leave us with the obligation to put in place this very expensive, very energy intensive, problematic treatment for drinking water that you mentioned?
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, Eric Gall from
Wait, just a second. We take another question. Eric, yeah.
Yes, from IFOAM Organics Europe, I have a question for Helmut Butcher. Could you please say a word about the kind of pesticides that contain PFAS and what are their main use in agriculture and how many of them would be concerned?
Okay, thank you. So, Sarah, can you take the first one, please?
So your question was if
what do we do with the water?
What do we do with the water? I'm no legal expert, so I'm not. I mean, the drinking water directive limits are there, and they will come into force in 2026. I don't think I have the legal expertise to say if it will require the removal of TFA. Maybe you have some thoughts on that yourself. Surely it will be immensely costly to deal with this, and I think it also brings in the question of extended producer responsibility and the role of PFAS producers, because we have TFA, but we have also thousands of others of PFAS, and they are already out there and they are still being produced and used, and we're facing huge costs. I know, because I'm from Sweden, that the city of Uppsala that has a lot of PFAS in the water due to the presence of the armed forces. They have, and Sweden is among the countries that have needed to install that have put in place strict thresholds for PFAS in drinking water. So they have had to install drinking water treatment to remove PFAS in the city of Uppsala, and the drinking water bill jumped by almost 30% in the beginning of the year. So here, I think, just to conclude, I think the question of who should pay for all of this is burning.
Thank you. But let's first ban them, and then we think about what we do with our dirty water. Helmut, I'm sorry. No, stop, because we are running out of time. So, Eric, your question was about which pesticides are they and their characteristics. Can you take this one, Helmut, please?
I can take this one, and I will also say a few words on the other question.
Very quickly.
At the heart of the problem, I think. It's 37 active substances. To these active substances, I would say there are 200, maybe 300 plant protection products related that have active substances that are PFAS pesticides and therefore emit TFA into the environment, which enters the water. So this is around 15% of the plant protection products that do not fulfill the requirements for authorization. The question, what kind of products they are, because of the huge number, 37 active substances, you have everything. You have herbicides, so they do most of the harm. It's flufenazet is the one that I think is the biggest producer of TFA, but also fungicides are following, as fluoxanam, for example. And the other question, I think this is one that I think the society, the European Union, has to decide how to deal with that, because I personally would think it would be very, very problematic to, and maybe even technically not possible, and producing a lot of energy costs to change the whole water supply to reverse osmosis, which would mean in Austria, for example, where I come from, we have 5,000 different water suppliers. So we would have in the end only 3, 4, 5 who could do this, or maybe 50. But the whole system would have to change, and we would have, as I said, artificial water. But the problem with TFA is, and this is in our legal expertise very clear, there is not much room to say it's not a relevant metabolite after what we know about the toxicity of this. That doesn't mean that the water is not drinkable. And when we look at the existing drinking water levels, which are toxicologically based, there is one, which is the most precautionary one from the Netherlands, which is 2.2 micrograms. And when we look into our drinking water testing, I think only one of the samples was above this. And even in this case, there is no danger in the moment. So if this value, and I think there is reason to assume, holds, then I would hope, that the European Union finds a way to define a maximum residual level in drinking water that is safe for the consumers and allows us also in the future to drink natural water, because otherwise our drinking water wouldn't be any more drinking water as we are used to drink.
Thank you very much, Helmut. Thank you, Sarah, for your interesting inputs. So now we will leave the floor to our journalist of the day, Natasha Fuchs, who will chair the debate. So invite the participants to take place. Thank you very much.
Go. Hello, yes, hello everyone, and thank you very much, Martin, for passing me the baton. So yes, as you can see, you have a new face moderating this next session. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Natasha Fuchs. I'm an agri-food journalist based here in Brussels. I have the pleasure of moderating this roundtable. So the two previous speakers led us very nicely into this discussion. This roundtable will have the opportunity to explore the impact of PFAS pesticides on agricultural workers and the broader population, with a specific focus on neurotoxicity. So to dig into this topic, we have with us today Enrico Somalia from EFAT, that's the European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Trade Unions. We're going to be talking about agricultural workers' exposure to these pesticides. We also have with us today Mathieu Ben Brahim, who is from the French NGO Génération Future. We've already spoken about them. And he's going to be speaking specifically about PFAS pesticides and neurotoxicity. And we're also very happy to welcome today Dr. Manuela Tiramani from EFSA, so the European Food Safety Authority, which has come up once or twice already. And she'll be speaking to us about neurotoxicity and regulatory perspective. So I'll do a first round of questions, but I'm not going to monopolize the floor. There'll also be a chance to ask our speakers your own questions, so keep that in mind as we're going along. So let me firstly come to Manuela. To set the scene a little bit on the work that EFSA is doing and is yet to do on PFAS, pesticides and neurotoxicity, also perhaps your reaction a little bit to what we've heard so far in the event. I understand that you've prepared a few slides, is that correct? Yes? Okay, I'll pass you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for inviting us here, because this event is very important for a number of reasons, touching on many things. Yes, I have a few slides which are not touching on PFAS, but I'm happy to add a couple of notes at the end also for information. So I started from the next slide, please. I started from what we have been doing on neurotoxicity and why I'm doing that. The purpose of this slide is to show that it's a long way, difficult, a lot of work has been done. Still, the more we know, the more we would like to know, also to put information in a regulatory context. And just to let you know that in the last 10 years, our investment, and we are not a research body, still we felt the need to progress in this area together with academia and researchers. We spent roughly 10 million to work on developmental neurotoxicity, where I would say very important progresses, of course, still ongoing. And we are starting basically this year, last year, on Parkinson's disease. Partnership with many actors, international actors, trying to also to move from the in vivo testing to the in vitro, obviously with the idea of animal welfare, but more than this, with the idea to being able to screen more substances together. Next slide, please. And yeah, just to say that in particular for DNT, we have developed an AOP. For those who are not familiar, is the adverse outcome pathway, which is actually the frontier, the next frontier on toxicology. And this is, I would say, the first one. And so we are using this. We are trying to engage with our stakeholders, also our colleagues, colleagues of in my unit have been collaborating with the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson. And we are also involved in the projects of other groups and other bodies. So really, we are trying to have as much as possible contact with the outside world and have inputs. And this event is also one of those. Next slide, please. So, but practically, what does it change for us as citizens and the work of analysis of and risk assessment of substances? We have been including standard sentences and requirements when we assess a substance, when we get it in the house. We include sentences to ask for specific features related to chronic neurotoxicity issues. During the peer review also, we are meeting, you know that our peer review as a step also the meeting with European experts, we also consider this. And also we are starting adding the gap for testing the substance with an AOP on neurotoxicity. Other things are, we have examples, recent or less recent, where we, despite the presence of in vivo testing, we identified some concerns for not covering all the possible issues. And so we introduce extra uncertainty factors. And we continue the involvement with stakeholders, and we need to enlarge training and communication, because this is not an easy topic also for the risk assessor to implement on a daily basis. Next, please. I took the freedom to add something on non-dietary exposure, because also this is something that for us is very important. It was mentioned already before that there's a guidance, revised guidance that was published in 2022. Next slide, please. And sorry, you can't see this. I'm sorry, I didn't test it before, but you can have the presentation afterwards. This slide is basically that after the publication of the guidance 2022, we held an event with stakeholders trying to say, to ask and to know with a survey before and discussion during the event, where shall we go now? Where are the needs? What you need and what we can do. And so we had a survey collecting all the needs, the concerns, but, and this is something very important, also the availability of data. I know that sometimes someone feels that we are using this as a way to maybe escape an issue. That's not the case, but I have to say that these are the current priorities. And I would like to focus on the fact that we are working on seed tropics, which is a model for seed treatment, recently finalized by a group of companies, residents and bystanders, and dislodgeable foliar residues. Just to be clear how it works when we get the data, it doesn't mean that if someone, whoever, prepare a model, we take it and automatically put it in our model. No. And that's where the problem comes in terms of workload and resources. We reconsider all single studies one by one, the statistics applied, and only after, if it meets our rules, we include it in the calculator that we have. Next one. So, few things, probably this is the most important, not complete, but that's what I would like to have your feedback on and also discussion. The availability of data is a major issue. And because, and I have to say, I spent a lot of time trying to engage, well-spent time, but we engage with data owner and also with academia, trying to understand the mutual needs. We are often told that we don't consider at all published studies. I have to say that when you prepare a model, the model has some rules to follow to have all the data comparable and then adjusted for what you need. And we have data from industry, but we also want data from academia. Actually, we are working with OECD trying to prepare a document clarifying the mutual needs, academia, research, and regulators. We are regulators, and the scope of regulators is exactly trying to find a way to have it included in a consistent way for the risk assessment in these cases. It was mentioned buffer zones. The data we have in the model currently is based on buffer zones up to 10 meters only. Then what the implementation is at national level, obviously, is outside our remit. But of course, the more data we have, the better we can refine the document. Drift data, a big part of the ongoing work, by the way, a work which has been, which is involving a consortium of member states. We are spending little less than €1 million for a 4-year program on this. Resources, just to say that you can, I hope you got the flavor of how much it costs. And so we try to do as much as we can with the resources and the data available. And now, just to say for TFA, so we can close the presentation here, but just to add on TFA that EFSA has a current mandate to establish reference values, toxicological reference values. And in parallel, ECHA is working at the classification of TFA. So the process has started in ECHA and in EFSA, and we are working together just to avoid that we overlap or we don't take our work into consideration. And so we expect that something could be available end of next year.
Thank you. Thank you. Ooh, yep. Thank you very much for that overview. Plenty of themes that you've brought up there, Parkinson's, the mixture of pesticides. We're going to come back to those and dig in a bit more detail. But firstly, Mathieu, let me turn to you now. Let's zoom in specifically on PFAS pesticides. Can you set the scene a little bit for us there? We've spoken a lot about this in the context of water, but I know that fruit and vegetables in Europe are being increasingly contaminated with PFAS pesticide residues. There was this analysis of official data from the national monitoring programs that showed these residues have tripled. Can you give us a bit of set the scene here? Why has this tripled? Why is this increasing? And what does this mean in terms of the focus that should be given to PFAS pesticides?
So thank you very much for this question and for the opportunity to speak here to all of you. So as you mentioned, PFAS pesticide has been increasingly used in the European Union in terms of volume. As Helmut mentioned, there are 37 active substances that are officially classified as PFAS, and 10 more were used up until 2024. That amount to about 12% of all the active substances used as pesticide. Concerning the why they are increasingly used, this is a very complex question on which there is not one good reason. PFAS are very persistent. They are very durable. That's one of the reasons they could be used in pesticide, because the effect of such pesticide would be more durable in the environment. There is also the question of some PFAS pesticides need to be used together, especially in herbicides. This means that to treat the same surface, the same area of land, you would need more volume of PFAS pesticide to be used. And there is also the question of the regrettable substitution, as phrased by ECHA. PFAS pesticides are also a substitute for older pesticides. So they were increasingly used because other pesticides were banned in the EU. And on the topic of the focus on those kind of substances, as you may know, there is currently an ongoing restriction process in the REACH regulation concerning the PFAS. Pesticides are, of course, excluded, unfortunately, of the scope of this restriction. And this means that PFAS pesticides are not really discussed on a regulatory level as a whole. And for us, this is a major issue. We cannot regulate PFAS as a whole if we cannot regulate PFAS pesticide, especially if we take into account the TFA issue that was raised before by Helmut. TFA is a metabolite of pesticide. It has not been correctly assessed during the assessment of the active substances, for instance, of flufenacet. And a lot of pesticides that are currently used in the EU should not have been authorized to be put on the market because TFA is extremely persistent, extremely mobile, and toxic. As such, we consider that we cannot continue to use PFAS pesticide as active substances in the EU. If we want to get rid of the PFAS pollution, if we want to tackle on the TFA situation, we need to ban these substances to ensure that we have access to safe water. If we want to keep the exposure of the agricultural workers, of the bystanders, of the inhabitants of areas near spraying zone, and also if we want to lower the residue of PFAS pesticides in food, in fruit and vegetable especially. So all of those questions related to PFAS pesticide are very complex. I don't think I have the time to dive much into the detail right now.
A little bit more, but not,
Little-
yes, not,
yeah, okay.
maybe a bit later on.
Yeah, maybe a later on. And yeah, that's basically the first few words I wanted to
Okay.
share.
Thank you for outlining that. It's very interesting as well to see the kind of knock-on effects there of the bans you were talking about, this turning to the PFAS. And I know you mentioned there that they're often used in conjunction with others, and we'll get back to that. So, but thank you very much for that overview. Enrico, let me turn to you now. Let's talk about worker exposure now to these pesticides. Now, I know studies are generally done with the assumption that workers are wearing all the gear and have all the idea, to the good agricultural practices, the standards. But I'm wondering from your perspective, what have you observed about the reality of what farmers are wearing when they apply the pesticides, the standards they're using? How well understood would you say the potential hazards of working with PFAS pesticides are for farmers?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for inviting EFAT. So the reality on the ground is quite difficult and quite challenging, and therefore all these statistics are important, but they have to be read with a certain perspective. And the perspective they have to be read have to take into consideration, I think, two main dimensions, because we cannot talk about exposure to pesticide if we don't take on board the conditions agricultural workers are facing in Europe, first of all, but also I think the way the agro-food sector works. I think it seems I'm taking the issue from very far away, but actually I'm not. And when it comes to the conditions, I think it's very important to underline, and I think it's not underlined enough also in this house, that when we talk about agricultural workers, well, a vast proportion of them in Europe is really facing deplorable and challenging living and working conditions. This is a sector where we have very high levels of undeclared work, around 32% of irregular employment, which take into consideration unregistered employment, underdeclared employment, and totally undeclared employment. It's a sector with very low wages. It's a sector with very long working hours. It's a sector also with the widespread exploitation. It's a sector where we have gangmaster abuse. We were in Strasbourg last week with 800 workers calling for EU action on intermediation and also on subcontracting and for more inspection. It's a sector where there are no controls on working conditions. In countries like Italy, for example, only less than 2% of CAP beneficiaries are actually controlled on a yearly basis. So this is basically nothing. And you can imagine when the situation is like this, where it's very difficult to talk about bringing evidence, because here we are talking at the end of the day about health and safety. And if my condition, maybe even as a migrant worker, because there are a vast proportion of workers who are migrant, doesn't allow me to report any violation of my rights, including on health and safety, including on the fact that I didn't have protective equipment. Well, because if I report that violation, I risk retaliation or I risk deportation because my conditions are so difficult. Well, the whole discussion and the lack of data is, of course, evident. If there is no reporting, well, there is not evidence and there are no data. So I think this is really the main issue that we have to address, and we have to address it by improving working conditions, strengthening collective bargaining, acting on migration, because many of these workers are migrants, and indeed we have many issues. But unfortunately, the direction the EU is taking, it goes absolutely on the opposite side. We are also even missing this term, a commissioner on jobs. It's called the people, preparedness, and skills. Then, of course, if you look into the portfolio, he has also some important social responsibilities. But the whole ambition on the social dimension of the EU is really missing. So I think this is really the first element we have to take on board, because it's again about health and safety when we talk about pesticides. And then the second dimension we have to take on board is really the way our food system works, because harmful pesticides are instrumental, I think, to a model of agriculture which is unsustainable both from an environmental and the social perspective. We have major issues linked to concentration, as we know, to the financialization of the sector. We have major issues linked to trade, including this huge hypocrisy that still exists in Europe on the fact that we are producing pesticides and exporting them to countries, pesticides that are already banned in the EU. And I think it's also a pity that the whole farmers' protests have been very much instrumentalized to go on the opposite way. So I think here we have to be a bit strategic also as social movements, environmental movements, in how we are going to tackle these issues, because I think just calling for the reduction is not enough. I think we have also to really engage and clarify the fact that we also need the just transition measures. And these just transition measures include the fact that we have to listen to working people, that we need to put social partners in the governance of the transition. Despite we don't like the word impact assessment, we need impact assessment, because impact assessment bring evidence also on the impact of pesticide on health and safety. And I know that you want me to close, but I still want to say one last thing, and it is the fact that it's also very important that we relaunch the whole discussion around SUR. Because that directive, that regulation, it was not only about cutting the use of pesticide, which of course we strongly support, but we managed to include also in the report of the European Parliament, which at the end didn't go through, important elements on health and safety, including the fact that farm workers were entitled to have official documentation on the kind of pesticide used during their work activity, because most of the time the diseases appear years after. And this kind of documentation is needed. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I was wondering if you were getting my subtle signals. You were. So thank you for that. And thank you for linking. I mean, absolutely, these populations are very vulnerable, can be very vulnerable, and linking that to pesticides, an important part of the discussion. So I am conscious of the clock ticking, but I have a few more questions, and then I want to throw it out to the floor. Manuela, I promised I would come back to this topic of Parkinson's. I know you touched upon it in your opening remarks. We've heard multiple times throughout this event the growing body of evidence suggesting a possible link between pesticide exposure and Parkinson's. You spoke about this 2022 conference that you had with the expert conference that found that the current risk assessment of linking, Parkinson's with pesticides was inadequate. I know that you touched upon it in your opening remarks, but can you zoom in a little bit and talk to us what exactly has happened and moved on this topic since 2022?
Yeah, actually, we go back a bit more than 2022, because already, I guess, in 2016, we confirmed that the link, epidemiological link between Parkinson and pesticide is there. So for us, it was clear. And we started working on these aspects, which led to this workshop. After this workshop, what's happening now? We have something like sorry to use money to quantify, but it's the most direct way to understand. So just to say that we've just awarded and started a work for about 3 million on this topic. The workshop served to collect the direct views on the direction we were willing to take, which is mitochondrial toxicity, and this is the direction we are going to. We hope that the network created, and we hope to enlarge it, by the way, but created already with developmental neurotoxicity would be a good basis, and actually we are having more and more partners will bring the results we hope. I think the structure of the project is very well done. We are in touch with other people working on the same topic from a different angles, because we would like at a certain point to merge together. So I would say, going back to what I said before, regulators understanding academia and vice versa, neurotoxicity in general for EFSA is a wonderful example. It took time because we speak different languages. We don't understand each other, and we want to be understood and to understand them. So we started 10, 15 years ago, and little by little we are going on. And now we are moving also to other areas. I hope this can work as a model. So I'm very hopeful that we will have some results in 2 or 3 years. Some preliminary will be published regularly. I'm not excluding also that there will be an event to share the things.
Thank you very much. And building on that question, Mathieu, I want to come to you now. One key criticism I know was also raised in the Génération Future report is that there's currently not an adequate assessment of long-term exposure, much longer-term exposure than we look at in the risk assessment now, and that impact on the development of neurodegenerative disease. So can you situate this? What does this mean in terms of our understanding of the link between pesticide exposure and the development of neurodegenerative diseases such as Parkinson's?
Thank you very much. So I won't be as technical as you, I believe. So yeah, the issue here, as mentioned before, is first of all an issue of reporting. We don't have indeed enough data are generated, and we understand that this creates lack of data that can be used by the authorities and regulators. Unfortunately, and as happy as we are to know that Parkinson's disease is now more taken into account by EFSA, we also know that there are a lot of other neurodegenerative disease that currently are not assessed. We know that neurotoxicity in the authorization to put on the market are only tested for behavior comportment and not for other kind of effect. So for us, we're very happy, and we're kind of happy we saw that in your presentation that a lot of the gaps that was mentioned by François were recognized by EFSA, and that you were working on creating more data and discussing with a lot of experts to increase the generation of data on this topic. But we also know that it's still not enough to tackle on this subject to see that the state of art in the academic fields has progressed a lot compared to the EFSA requirement and in the guide that what is taken into account, especially considering that the tests currently done by the industrial for these active substances are quite different than what is generally done by the academic studies. So we know that there are gaps. We know that there are lacks of data. We hope that EFSA will continue working on generating data, on discussing with the academic fields, and we hope that this new assessment of especially neurotoxicological effect, but also other effects, can be done for other active substances and considering the PFAS active substances, of course. So yeah, I don't know if I still have some time or
not really.
Not really. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
I'm going to try. Would you like a quick response?
Super quick. Thanks for this. We would also love to be able to cover as much as possible everything, but please use. I would like to use this as a contact. If you have data, if you are working on something, we are glad to have a chat with you and tell you what we would need to include them and what you can provide us with. I'm always available to be contacted for this and then find the right colleagues. So please use this opportunity. For me, it's an opportunity if you would contact me. Thank you.
Okay, invitation there extended to everyone. Thank you for that. I'll have just a couple more questions and then I throw it out to the floor. Enrico, I just want to come to you on one point, and this is something I was a bit surprised about when I was preparing for this panel, and that is that there's often an assumption that the use of protective equipment, I mean, you spoke a lot about this, for reducing exposure. The assumption is that by using the equipment, you'll have less exposure. But actually, there is some questioning of that now. And I want to dig into it a little bit. I mean, there is even some evidence to suggest it might increase exposure. And I'm not sure how that's possible, or what does that mean for what we can suggest to workers to better protect themselves?
Yeah, I mean, there are studies that shows that actually protective equipments are not enough, because the way, first of all, because there can be mistakes, there can be errors in the way they wear protective equipments. Secondly, because unfortunately agriculture is done in very hot environment as well, and of course sometimes workers are facing challenging conditions. They are even dying. We have also example of fatalities linked to high temperatures. So this is also changing the way or protective equipment are used, or can have an impact on that. And there are studies that show actually that they are not the way forward. The way forward is cutting pesticides, progressively reducing them, and in particular, immediately ban those that evidence shows that they are bad for our health. And then there is an additional element, which is from my point of view, what we need, because at the end of the day, we are talking about, again, a just transition. Reducing pesticides is part of achieving a green transition, but also a just transition. And I think what we heard also from the other two speakers is the lack of resources. We lack resources for ECA and EFSA to carry out study and assessment in a transparent way, in a neutral way. I think in an ideal world, they should have their own resources to carry out their assessment. We are missing resources also to ensure that farm workers have trainings without paying. For example, why this money should not be taken also from the CAP funding. So in this respect, there are ways to improve working conditions, the ways to cut and reduce pesticides, but also to work on training and to increase also the sanctions in case protective equipment are not provided.
Right, thank you for that. And you mentioned EFSA there, which is a nice segue to my last question, because Manuel, I have one more question for you, and I saved a big one for last. So I just want to come back to this idea of the cocktail effects. This is one of the key concerns. It's a long-standing one. It's a very recurring concern. We've been talking about this for many years now. There's been long-standing calls for EFSA to develop approaches for assessing combined exposure to multiple pesticides. Matthew mentioned, particularly with PFAS, that can be a major concern. I suppose my question is, why hasn't it happened yet? What are the blocks here for EFSA?
Well, actually, we have developed we have focused on some organs where we can produce a combined risk assessment. We are now with the neurotox, thyroid, malformation, craniofacial malformation, kidney. We are working, just published, and next liver. It's progressing. It's immense work, but it's progressing. And according to the roadmap that is published in our website, roadmap EFSA Commission, next step is for the non-dietary cumulative and combined risk assessment. Just to say that next year there will be an event and you will be involved to collect proposal ideas, data. Because if it was difficult for consumers where we have a good monitoring program, you can imagine, Enrico just mentioned, the specificity of the agricultural world. And you can imagine how difficult it will be to have good data to work on. It's progressing. Of course, it's intense in terms of resources, but I would say we are progressing. We are going on. Maybe we should go faster, probably, but we do with the resources we have. But the next step is include also non-dietary cumulative risk assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. And so now I will throw out to the floor for questions. We have not much time, but we can take a couple of questions. So yes, I'll go at the back first. If you could just introduce yourself, keep your question nice and concise if possible.
Yes. Oh, is that working? Great. I'm Nick from the Pesticide Action Network UK. It's lovely to be back in the EU. Thank you. Just want to bring this around to a question of social justice. So whilst we're looking for these linkages, and I'm thinking particularly paraquat and Parkinson's perhaps, there are people that are already suffering the ill health effects of pesticide exposure, and that may well be something that's banned, no longer approved, no longer used in the EU. Who's going to pick up the bill for that? Who is going to pay for this? Is it going to be left as it always is to society to pay the bill, or will there be attempts to actually try and get the people that have caused this to pay? And I think this is appropriate as it's the 40th anniversary of the Bhopal disaster, and nobody's picked up the bill for that yet either. So I'd really like your comments on that.
All right. On footing the bill, who wants to take this? Enrique?
Well, I think, so first of all, thanks a lot for the question. I think we go back to some of the issues that we have mentioned. There is a clear issues linked to the working conditions, which don't allow reporting, but then we are also missing, in a way, the channels to report in an easy and fair way. And after reporting, there should be recognition and there should be fairly compensation. Yeah. And of course, you have compensation if a disease, an occupational disease, here we're talking about occupational diseases, are recognized. And if they're not recognized, the issue probably is linked to all the problems that we mentioned here, the lack of resources, the lack of assessment. At the end of the day, is the lack of political will. Evidence is already there. They know that these pesticides are dangerous for workers, for farm workers' health and for citizens' health. It's just a matter of political will, because of course, we go back to the fact that our agro-food system works in this way, and agrochemical companies unfortunately have a huge power of influence on decision makers. So the way forward for us is as I said, is an holistic approach. We need a set of measures, but for sure we need easy reporting, recognition, and compensation. And this was just a step. We were almost there with the SUR regulation, because the Parliament had agreed to present amendments that include this kind of official documentation on the kind of pesticide used during the work activity. Because if I have this documentation, then maybe we know that sometimes it's after many years that a pesticide or a chemical product in general is recognized as hazardous. Having this documentation would allow farm workers to show that he or she has used that kind of product during his work activity, and maybe get recognition and compensation. But of course, the main objective should be prevention.
Okay, thank you. Matthew, you wanted a few words on this point?
Yeah, just a few words very quickly. So thank you very much for your question, which I think is very relevant. I think it's linked more generally to the cost of the chemical pollution, to the pesticides, and to the exactly who pays. And that's why we are very, very favorable to the principle of the polluters pay, and to an increase in the transparency in the European Union and in each member states of who's producing what, who's using what, just as you mentioned, and to facilitate the recognition of occupational disease and to increase the safety of workers, of inhabitants, of bystanders, of consumers, of citizens as a whole.
Right, thank you. We had a question here as well.
Yes, so I like very much the attention that Enrico gave to, let's say, the situation of the worker trying to protect himself, not having maybe the technical means for that, but more importantly, the training. And then I think it's very good that EFSA addresses the non-dietary exposure. I would like to point out an example that, let's say, currently we believe that the problems with non-dietary exposure are related to, well, poor awareness of, let's say, the pesticide exposure risk, But actually in the US, a couple of months ago, a study was published on glyphosate biomonitoring, showing actually that skin exposure is a main driver of the exposure, knowing that, let's say, glyphosate is not well absorbed by the skin. That raised the question related to the use of PPE, because I think that you mentioned that PPE could also become a source of exposure, secondary exposure, if you don't use it in the correct way. And I think that would be something to address maybe in future work. I hope.
Quite hear a question there. I think it was more of a statement, but did you want to come in? Anyone want to respond on this?
Thank you. I think there's always this tension between shall we reflect how the work should be done, or shall we reflect a work that is not done after the worker has been trained? Let's not forget that there's a European law and national law for which the employer has to train the employees correctly to avoid a risk. So there's always this issue on whether we should consider one or the other. But of course, I'm interested in, by the way, we are also working on new data, if I'm not mistaken, on personal protective equipment. So to see if what we have used so far should be updated. Big topic though, I'd be curious to have a chat what we should do, because let's not forget that workers in Europe need to be trained to work in safe condition and to be given safe condition by their employer. So it's always a bit of a tension here.
Yeah, and I think that the point that you raised about the migrant workers, I think is then, you know, who will take responsibility?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Sorry, I've pushed it right to the last minute. So unfortunately, I am going to have to bring this roundtable to a close. But thank you very much to all of our speakers. Thank you. Perhaps a round of applause for our speakers. And I will now pass the floor back to Angeliki.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. We are at the end of the meeting today, and now I'm very, the aim of our meeting today was to bring the focus on pesticide discussions back to the impacts that the use of these pesticides have on human health. And we wanted to address not just farmers, farm workers, but also residents of agricultural zones, children, and as well as consumers. And I feel we achieved that. So thank you very much to all the speakers for coming here today and contributing to this event. We heard in the first panel, we heard examples from real life exposures from scientists where they measured more, like in the first presentation, we saw there was more than 200 substances that they detected in the blood or urine of human samples. We heard how there are data gaps in gaps in the risk assessment, like for example, how we're not addressing mixtures, how we're not looking at the microbiome impact into, especially now that we know more about gut-brain balance and how this affects health and the immune system. We heard how looking at cohorts from studies, mothers with their children, how they develop behavioral problems, cognition problems, but also how there is multiple exposure to various pesticides, some of them that they were used ages ago and they're still around us. We heard how it's children's right to protect them from chemicals and from pesticides. And thank you, Suzanne, for bringing this back on the table. And we heard also how the exposure assessment done right now by EFSA, but also by member states, that it doesn't take into account all types of exposure, and it leaves outside, unfortunately, the most vulnerable, which is the children. So we also heard that we do have a very good pesticide regulation in Europe, which is, we have actually a very rigorous system to assess the impact of these chemicals and remove them from the market if we find that they cause harm. But we've seen that this system has serious faults because, as we saw with the case, for example, for PFAS pesticides, they're being approved. Some of them were recently approved, and they're contaminating our waters to a level that we cannot clean up anymore. So we're not in prevention, but we have to find really expensive ways to clean up. And we're going to be discussing who is going to pay for this. Is it going to be citizens, or it shouldn't be citizens, let's say. That's for sure. It should be the polluters. And then we heard about that we do have a rigorous system in place, as EFSA explained, but it is surprising that we're still not protected. Like neurotoxicity is still not properly assessed. So we have like Parkinson's disease, which we know that it's an occupational disease that it still needs to be addressed in the risk assessment. So this is a major shortcoming. But we are very pleased to hear that the work continues on this, and we hope that the independent science is taken into account and a precautionary approach is applied, so we remove the chemicals from the market, these pesticides from the market. And for this, we already have the citizens on our side. We have Pan-Europe has been coordinating 2 European citizens initiatives where more than 1 million people in each one, so it was twice. They call for a pesticide-free agriculture. Recently, we also had a poll that from, I think it was 75 to 82% of European citizens, they are concerned about the impact of pesticides on their health and the environment. And now we are in the moment that we have a new European Commission, and we heard the President of the Commission that is it has promised to deliver the commitments under the European Green Deal. So we expect that this will include pesticides and the reduction of chemical input in agriculture. And we also saw that the political priorities, which is really important, is said that we're going to reward nature-based solutions in farming. And this is really important because in a time of pollution and biodiversity crisis that we are at the moment, and we should not forget this, to put the protection of, we need to prioritize the protection of people's health. And we need to put in place measures to ensure that our children are protected from pesticides and gradually move towards pesticide-free agricultural system that farmers, but also residents of agricultural zone, even consumers, that can feel protected from these chemicals. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to everybody that's here today. Those are following us online, to all the speakers, and of course, the Parliament and all members of the Parliament. And we're looking forward to working with you in this term. Thank you.